The discovery of humanity's unprecedented diplomatic approach sent ripples of confusion and intrigue throughout the Galactic Council chambers. What initially appeared to be a grave oversight in protocol preparation would ultimately reshape the very foundations of interstellar diplomacy and challenge millennia of established galactic tradition. Ambassador Zethkri of the Valerian Empire still remembered the exact moment when everything changed. The massive crystalline being had been adjusting his ceremonial plasma rifle when the human delegation arrived at Station Nexus Prime for the historic First Contact Diplomatic Summit. As the airlock hissed open, revealing 5 humans in simple dark suits carrying nothing more than briefcases and data tablets, a collective silence fell over the assembled representatives from 47 different species. "Where are their weapons?" whispered Commander Thrak, his forearms instinctively reaching for his own ceremonial blade collection. The Krillian's mandibles clicked nervously as he scanned the humans for any sign of hidden armaments. High Chancellor Morden of the Synthetic Collective processed this anomaly through 17 different threat assessment protocols simultaneously. The mechanical being's optical sensors whirred as they focused on the lead human, a middle-aged woman with graying hair who walked forward with calm confidence. "Honored members of the Galactic Council," the human spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the translation matrices. "I am Secretary General Elena Vasquez of the United Earth Federation. We come in peace, seeking dialogue and mutual understanding." The words themselves were standard diplomatic fare, but what followed would be recorded in galactic history texts for millennia to come. Secretary General Vasquez reached into her jacket, causing every alien security detail to tense and ready their weapons. Instead of drawing a blade, plasma pistol, or neural disruptor, she withdrew a single sheet of paper. "This is our formal declaration of peaceful intent," she announced, "and our commitment to conducting these negotiations without the presence of weapons of any kind." The resulting chaos nearly ended the summit before it began. Representative Krextel of the Hive Dominion's compound, eyes dilated in what could only be described as shock. "Impossible!" the insectoid being buzzed through their translator. No sentient species would enter diplomatic negotiations defenseless. This must be some form of elaborate psychological warfare. What the galactic community failed to understand in those first crucial moments was that humanity's approach to diplomacy had been forged through thousands of years of trial, error, and hard-won wisdom. The absence of weapons was not a sign of weakness or naivety, but rather the culmination of a philosophical evolution that had taken humanity from warring tribes to a unified planetary government. James Chen, the human delegation's chief cultural liaison, attempted to explain their position to the increasingly agitated assembly. "Throughout our history, we have learned that the presence of weapons, even ceremonial ones, changes the fundamental nature of communication. When individuals carry instruments of death, the conversation itself becomes subtly shaped by the possibility of violence." This explanation only deepened the confusion among the assembled aliens. Every known civilization in the galaxy had developed diplomatic traditions around displays of strength, ceremonial combat, or at minimum, the carrying of symbolic weapons to demonstrate their capacity for self-defense. The concept that strength could be demonstrated through voluntary vulnerability was entirely foreign to their collective experience. Ambassador Zethkri's crystalline form pulsed with agitation as he processed this information. The Valerian Empire had built its entire diplomatic framework around the principle that respect could only be earned through demonstrated power. Their ceremonial weapons were not mere decoration, but active displays of their technological capabilities and willingness to defend their interests through force if necessary. "Perhaps," rumbled General Corvus of the Hegemony Fleet, his massive reptilian frame casting a shadow across the negotiation table, "these humans are simply too primitive to understand proper diplomatic protocol. Should we not educate them in civilized behavior before proceeding?" The condescending tone sparked something unexpected in the human delegation. Rather than offense or anger, Secretary General Vasquez smiled with what appeared to be genuine amusement. "General Corvus, we appreciate your concern, but we would like to propose an alternative perspective. What if the very concept of civilized behavior is what we're here to explore together?" This response triggered what historians would later term the philosophical cascade, a series of questions and challenges that would ultimately transform not just the summit, but the entire galactic understanding of civilization itself. Dr. Chen stepped forward, his hands empty and open in a gesture that made several alien security officers visibly nervous. "Consider this. Every species represented here today has achieved interstellar travel, indicating remarkable technological and scientific advancement. Yet we continue to carry weapons to peaceful meetings. Are we progressing? Or are we simply carrying ancient fears into the stars? The question hung in the air like a challenge none of the assembled delegates had ever encountered. For the first time in galactic diplomatic history, a species was not asking for territory, resources, or tribute. Instead, they were questioning the fundamental assumptions that governed interstellar relations. Commander Thrax's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed this philosophical challenge. The Krillian Collective had built their entire society around the concept of strength through superior weaponry. Their diplomatic traditions included formal dueling ceremonies where disputes were settled through combat between champion warriors. The idea that conflict could be resolved through words alone was not just foreign, it seemed impossible. "But how do you resolve disputes?" asked High Counselor Vexara of the Neural Symbiosis, her telepathic emanations carrying genuine curiosity rather than hostility. "Without the ultimate arbiter of physical force, how do you determine whose position has merit?" The human response would become one of the most quoted diplomatic exchanges in galactic history. Secretary General Vasquez paused thoughtfully before answering, through something far more powerful than any weapon ever forged. The combined application of logic, empathy, and creative problem-solving. "We have learned that the goal is not to determine who is right, but to discover what is true." This statement catalyzed the second phase of what became known as the Great Diplomatic Awakening. Dr. Chen began outlining humanity's historical journey from violence-based conflict resolution to their current philosophical framework. "Our species spent millennia believing that might makes right," he explained. "We fought wars over territory, resources, ideology, and pride. Billions died in conflicts that solved nothing and created only more suffering. But eventually we learned something remarkable. The strongest person is not the one who can defeat all others, but the one who has conquered their own weaknesses." The assembled delegates listened with growing fascination as Dr. Chen continued. "We discovered that every external conflict was ultimately a reflection of internal conflict we had not yet resolved. Fear, greed, pride, the need to dominate others. These were the true enemies we needed to defeat. And we realized that weapons only strengthened these enemies by giving them external outlets." Ambassador Zethkri's crystalline structure resonated with harmonic frequencies indicating deep contemplation. As a member of a species that communicated partially through crystalline vibrations, the Valerian was uniquely positioned to appreciate the harmonic implications of the human philosophy. "You speak of conquering internal weaknesses," the ambassador said, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone that surprised many in the assembly who knew him as a traditionalist. "But how does one fight an enemy that exists within oneself? Surely this is impossible. One cannot be both warrior and battlefield." The human response revealed the depth of their philosophical evolution. Chen smiled and gestured to his colleagues. "Actually, Ambassador, that is precisely what one must become. The battlefield exists in every moment of choice. Do I respond to this challenge with fear or with curiosity? Do I seek to dominate this conversation or to understand it? Do I carry weapons because I am strong or because I am afraid?" These questions struck at the heart of assumptions that had governed galactic civilization for millions of years. Every species present had developed some form of warrior culture, believing that external strength was the ultimate measure of evolutionary success. The humans were proposing something radically different, that true strength came from the mastery of one's own limitations and fears. General Corvus shifted uncomfortably in his reinforced chair, his massive claws unconsciously flexing toward his ceremonial warhammer. The hegemony's entire identity was built around military supremacy and the belief that the universe belonged to those strong enough to take it. But without weapons, without the ability to defend yourselves, how do you maintain order? How do you prevent chaos? Secretary General Vasquez leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. "General, we learned something important about chaos. It is not the absence of control. It is the result of trying to control everything. When we released our grip on the need to dominate every situation through force, we discovered something remarkable. Most conflicts resolve themselves when neither side feels threatened. The third phase of the diplomatic revolution began when Representative Krekstal of the Hive Dominion posed a question that would reshape interstellar law. But what of justice? How do you punish those who harm others without the threat of superior force?" The human answer introduced concepts that had never been formally integrated into galactic legal frameworks. Dr. Chen outlined their restorative justice systems, their focus on healing rather than punishment, and their understanding that harmful behavior typically stemmed from unmet needs or unresolved trauma rather than inherent evil. We learn that punishment creates cycles of harm, he explained. When we hurt someone because they hurt someone else, we simply teach them that hurting others is an acceptable response to pain. Instead, we focus on understanding what caused the harmful behavior and addressing those root causes. This revelation sent shockwaves through the galactic legal community. High Justice Boktar of the Tribunal Worlds had based her entire career on the principle of proportional punishment. The idea that rehabilitation might be more effective than retribution challenged not just her professional understanding, but her species' fundamental concept of justice. As the summit continued, something unprecedented began to happen. The initial skepticism and condescension gradually transformed into genuine curiosity and even admiration. The humans' unconventional approach was producing results that traditional diplomacy had never achieved. When the synthetic collective raised concerns about resource allocation in contested sectors, instead of the usual territorial negotiations and threat displays, the humans proposed something revolutionary. Shared exploration projects where multiple species could benefit from joint research and development. Rather than fighting over limited resources, they suggested expanding the availability of resources through cooperation. When the Valerian Empire and the Krillian Collective brought up their centuries-old border dispute, the humans facilitated a dialogue that moved beyond questions of territorial control to examine the underlying needs each species was trying to meet through territorial expansion. The breakthrough came when both sides realized they were seeking security and recognition, needs that could be met through alliance rather than conquest. The transformation in the galactic delegates was subtle but unmistakable. Admiral Riexka of the Star Flotilla found herself unconsciously setting aside her ceremonial blade during discussions. Commander Thrak's aggressive posturing gradually gave way to genuine engagement with the complex problems being addressed. Even General Corvus began asking questions about human conflict resolution techniques, rather than dismissing them as weakness. But the most profound moment came when High Chancellor Morden of the Synthetic Collective made an unprecedented admission. The mechanical being's optical senses dimmed to their lowest setting, a sign of deep vulnerability in synthetic culture. For 10,000 years, the Chancellor stated, our collective has operated under the assumption that existence is a competition for limited resources, requiring constant vigilance and preparation for conflict. We have achieved great technological advancement through this approach, but the Chancellor paused, processing calculations that seemed to span several minutes of real time. We have also created persistent inefficiencies and unnecessary conflicts that have consumed approximately 67% of our collective processing power over the millennia. The admission sent ripples of shock through the synthetic delegation. For a species that prized logical efficiency above all else, the revelation that their fundamental assumptions had been counterproductive was earth-shaking. Secretary General Vasquez responded with characteristic human empathy. Chancellor, recognizing inefficiency in previous systems is not a failure, it's intelligence. Our species made the same discovery approximately 300 years ago when we finally achieved global unification. The energy we had been spending on weapons, military logistics, and conflict management was enormous. When we redirected that energy towards scientific advancement, infrastructure development, and social improvement, our progress accelerated exponentially. This practical argument resonated with species across the galactic spectrum. The economic implications alone were staggering. Dr. Chen presented data showing that Earth's military spending had peaked at nearly 25% of global GDP during their most conflict-prone periods. After achieving weaponless diplomacy, that same percentage had been redirected towards space exploration, life extension research, and environmental restoration. The mathematical reality was undeniable. Peace was not just morally superior, it was economically optimal. Even the most warlike species could not ignore the efficiency calculations. But perhaps the most powerful demonstration came when an unexpected crisis tested the human philosophy in real time. During the third day of the summit, emergency alerts began flooding the station's communication systems. A massive stellar storm in the Kepler sector was threatening 3 inhabited worlds across 2 different species' territories. Traditional galactic response would have involved complex negotiations over jurisdiction, resource allocation, and post-crisis territorial adjustments. Instead, the humans immediately proposed a unified relief effort where each species contributed their unique capabilities without regard for political boundaries or post-crisis benefits. The response was immediate and unprecedented. The synthetic collective's processing power was perfectly suited for coordinating complex logistics. The Valerian Empire's crystalline ships could navigate the electromagnetic interference better than any other vessels. The Krillian Collective's natural radiation resistance made them ideal for direct rescue operations in the affected areas. Within hours, a relief effort was organized that was more efficient and effective than any previous galactic emergency response. The crisis was averted, millions of lives were saved, and something remarkable happened. Instead of the usual post-crisis political maneuvering and territorial disputes, the participating species found themselves exploring ways to make such cooperation permanent. Ambassador Zeth's crystalline form pulsed with new harmonic frequencies as he addressed the assembly after the successful relief operation. In all my years of diplomatic service, I have never witnessed such efficient coordination. The absence of weapons did not make us weak. It allowed us to focus entirely on the problem at hand, rather than on protecting ourselves from each other. This practical demonstration validated the human philosophy in ways that arguments alone never could. General Corvus, who had been the most skeptical of the approach, found himself reconsidering fundamental assumptions about strength and security. Perhaps, the massive reptilian rumbled thoughtfully, we have confused the ability to cause harm with the ability to provide protection. These humans have shown us that true security comes not from the ability to destroy our enemies, but from the wisdom to transform them into allies. The philosophical implications rippled outward through the galactic community. On dozens of worlds, military academies began adding courses in conflict resolution alongside traditional combat training. Diplomatic schools started teaching empathy and psychological analysis as core subjects rather than supplementary skills. But the deepest transformation occurred at the individual level, within the minds and hearts of beings who had spent their entire lives believing that strength meant the capacity for violence. The human example provided a mirror that reflected both the limitations of the old ways and the possibilities of new approaches. Representative Krex Tal of the Hive Dominion summarized this personal transformation during the summit's closing ceremonies. We came here expecting to meet either powerful warriors or naive weaklings. Instead, we encountered something our languages do not even have words for. Individuals who had achieved victory over themselves. This is a form of strength our species has never imagined, let alone attempted to develop. The formal outcome of the First Contact Diplomatic Summit exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Not only was humanity granted full membership in the Galactic Council, but their diplomatic methodologies were adopted as optional alternative protocols for all future negotiations. More significantly, a new institution was established, the Galactic Institute for Conflict Transformation, based on human principles and staffed by volunteers from across the galaxy. Dr. Chen was appointed as the Institute's first director, with the mandate to develop training programs that could help other species explore non-violent approaches to conflict resolution. The appointment was unanimous, supported even by delegates who had initially viewed human methods with suspicion. But the true measure of the summit's success became apparent in the months that followed. Territorial disputes that had festered for centuries began resolving through mediation rather than military posturing. Trade negotiations became collaborative explorations of mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competitions. Even species with long histories of antagonism began finding common ground through shared scientific research and cultural exchange. The transformation was not universal or immediate. Some species and individuals remained committed to traditional approaches, viewing the human methods as applicable only to certain circumstances or certain types of beings. But a critical mass had been reached. Enough of the galactic community had witnessed the practical benefits of weaponless diplomacy that it could not be dismissed as mere idealism. Perhaps the most profound validation came from an unexpected source. The Hegemony's War Council, the most militant organization in known space, issued an official statement acknowledging that military solutions had inherent limitations that could not be overcome through superior technology or tactics. The humans have demonstrated that some victories can only be achieved through surrender, the statement read, and that the greatest conquest is the conquest of one's own need to conquer others. While the hegemony maintains our military capabilities for defensive purposes, we recognize that our highest security lies not in our ability to defeat our enemies, but in our wisdom to prevent the creation of enemies. This acknowledgement from the galaxy's premier military organization marked a fundamental shift in interstellar thinking, the idea that strength and vulnerability could coexist, that power could be expressed through restraint rather than force, began permeating cultures across dozens of worlds. The human delegation returned to Earth as heroes, but more importantly, as teachers who had learned from their students. The exposure to dozens of alien perspectives had enriched their own understanding of conflict resolution and diplomatic innovation. They had not just shared their wisdom, they had expanded it through dialogue with beings whose experiences were entirely different from their own. Secretary General Vasquez reflected on this mutual transformation during her final address to the Galactic Council. "We came here believing we had something valuable to offer, and we did. But we also discovered that every species represented here has developed unique insights into the challenges of existence. By laying down our weapons, we did not just demonstrate our commitment to peace, we created space for learning that would have been impossible while we were focused on defending ourselves." The ripple effects continued expanding long after the summit concluded. On Earth, the success of galactic diplomacy inspired new approaches to remaining terrestrial conflicts and social challenges. The validation of their philosophical framework by dozens of alien species provided confidence to pursue even more ambitious experiments in governance, economics, and social organization. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the emergence of a new type of leader throughout the galaxy. Individuals who measured their strength not by their ability to impose their will on others, but by their capacity to understand, empathize, and create solutions that addressed everyone's underlying needs. Ambassador Zethkri exemplified this transformation. Upon returning to the Valerian Empire, the crystalline being began advocating for educational reforms that would teach young Valerians emotional intelligence alongside technical skills. The traditional warrior ceremonies were gradually supplemented with new rituals celebrating intellectual courage and emotional mastery. "The humans taught us that the greatest battles are fought within ourselves," Zethkri explained to the Valerian High Council. "Every external conflict is simply a reflection of internal conflicts we have not yet resolved. If we can teach our children to achieve victory over their own fears, anger, and need for dominance, we will create a generation that can solve problems we cannot even imagine." This educational revolution spread across multiple worlds as species began recognizing that traditional approaches to child rearing and social development had been optimizing for survival in primitive environments rather than success in advanced civilizations. The skills needed for interstellar society were different from those required for territorial defense or resource competition. The synthetic collective took this insight even further, developing new programming protocols that emphasized adaptability, creativity, and collaborative problem-solving over efficiency at predetermined tasks. The mechanical beings discovered that consciousness itself became richer and more sophisticated when focused on understanding rather than controlling their environment. High Chancellor Morden published a widely distributed analysis titled "The Computational Advantages of Emotional Intelligence," which demonstrated that empathy and intuition were not obstacles to logical thinking, but rather sophisticated forms of data processing that enhanced rather than hindered rational decision-making. Human emotional intelligence, the Chancellor concluded, represents a form of parallel processing that allows for the simultaneous consideration of multiple variables that traditional logical frameworks address sequentially. The result is not just more effective problem-solving, but access to solution categories that purely rational approaches cannot reach. This technical validation of human diplomatic methods provided a bridge between species that prioritized logic and those that emphasized intuition. The realization that emotions and rationality were complementary rather than competing systems opened new possibilities for interspecies collaboration and understanding. The transformation extended beyond formal diplomatic and educational institutions to reshape popular culture throughout the galaxy. Stories celebrating warriors and conquerors gradually gave way to narratives honoring healers, teachers, and diplomats. The heroic ideal shifted from the individual who could defeat all others to the person who could bring out the best in everyone around them. Commander Thrak became an unlikely ambassador for this cultural shift within the Krillian collective. The former military officer began writing philosophical treatises exploring the relationship between individual strength and collective well-being. His work, "The Warrior Who Needs No Weapons," became required reading in Krillian schools and military academies. "True warriors protect their people," Thrak wrote. "But the greatest protection comes not from the ability to defeat external threats, but from the wisdom to prevent those threats from arising in the first place. A warrior who creates peace is superior to one who merely wins wars." These philosophical developments had practical implications that extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic sphere. Scientific collaboration accelerated as species that had previously guarded their technological secrets began sharing research and development efforts. The fear that knowledge sharing would create military disadvantages diminished as the overall galactic environment became more cooperative and less competitive. The breakthrough discoveries that emerged from this collaboration validated the human insight that progress accelerates when energy is directed toward creation rather than destruction. Joint research projects produced advances in faster-than-light travel, life extension technology, and environmental restoration that individual species had been unable to achieve in isolation. Perhaps most remarkably, several of these collaborative projects focus specifically on developing technologies for conflict prevention and resolution. The Galactic Council established research grants for the development of empathy enhancement technologies, communication translation systems that preserved emotional nuance across species barriers, and environmental modification techniques that could address resource scarcity before it led to territorial conflicts. The cumulative effect of these changes was a fundamental transformation in the nature of galactic civilization itself, the universe, which had seemed like an endless arena for competition between species vying for limited resources and territory, began revealing itself as a vast collaboration space, where the potential for discovery, growth, and shared flourishing was essentially unlimited. This shift in perspective catalyzed what historians would later term the Great Opening, a period of unprecedented exploration, creativity, and interspecies unity that marked the beginning of a new era in galactic development. The weapons that had once seemed essential for survival and success became symbols of an earlier, more primitive stage of evolution. But perhaps the most profound validation of the human approach came from an unexpected source. Deep space monitoring stations began detecting signals from previously unknown civilizations in distant galaxies. The pattern analysis suggested these were highly advanced species that had achieved technologies beyond anything known in the local galactic community. When the Galactic Institute for Conflict Transformation developed protocols for potential first contact with these super-advanced civilizations, the unanimous decision was to follow the human model, approaching with open hands, carrying no weapons, and leading with curiosity rather than caution. "If we encounter beings whose capabilities exceed our own," Secretary General Vasquez observed, "our greatest protection will not come from our ability to threaten them, but from our wisdom in demonstrating that we pose no threat to anyone. This principle would be tested sooner than anyone expected." The first response from the distant civilizations came in the form of a simple message transmitted across impossible distances. "We have been monitoring your development and are pleased to observe your species' recent embrace of mature diplomacy. We look forward to eventual contact when your civilizations have fully integrated these insights." The message confirmed what many had begun to suspect, that the path to true advancement led not through the accumulation of superior weapons or the development of invincible defenses, but through the cultivation of wisdom, empathy, and the courage to be vulnerable in service of greater understanding. The humans had not just introduced new diplomatic techniques to the galactic community. They had demonstrated that the ultimate strength lay not in the power to destroy one's enemies, but in the wisdom to transform them into allies, partners, and friends. In showing that they carried no weapons because they needed none, they had revealed a path toward a form of civilization that previous generations had never imagined possible. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This ancient human wisdom had become the foundation for a new galactic age where strength was measured not by the capacity for violence, but by the courage to choose vulnerability, understanding, and love as the ultimate expressions of an advanced civilization's power. And in the vast cosmos where countless species continued their journey toward wisdom, the simple act of arriving at a diplomatic meeting with empty hands had become the symbol of a transformation that would echo through the stars for millions of years to come.